The Challenge, Bessie Coleman's Story by Margaret Roberts. The little airplane soared higher and higher into the clear blue sky. Every face in the crowd was turned upward, watching. The only sound was the plane's engine. It grew fainter as the plane went higher. Suddenly, the plane flipped upside down. It began to fall, almost like a leaf, turning over and over. The silence on the ground exploded into a great cry. But the cry turned into laughter as the plane righted itself and began to climb again. In a flash, the pilot leveled the aircraft and began a series of snap rolls. The plane spun like a top. The crowd yelled and cheered. The show of aerial acrobatics ended 10 minutes later as the plane came in for a perfect landing. The pilot, 30-year-old Bessie Coleman, hopped down from the open cockpit. She grinned as she took off her goggles and unbuttoned her heavy jacket. The date was September 3rd, 1922. Orville and Wilbur Wright had flown the first airplane less than 20 years ago. Now, who was this incredible woman? Bessie Coleman, the first black woman to fly an airplane, was born January 26, 1892. She was the 10th of 13 children. When Bessie was 9 years old, her father left the family home in Texas and never returned. To earn money for food and clothing, the children picked cotton on a nearby plantation. Their mother took in washing and did maid work for a white family in town. Bessie was a good student. She completed all 8 grades at the school for black children. She wanted to continue her education, but in those days, white people and black people went to separate schools. Unfortunately, there was no black high school close enough for Bessie to attend. As a young teenager, Bessie dreamed of becoming a famous pilot. It seemed an impossible goal, but Bessie was never one to shy away from challenges. She had great determination and confidence. Carefully, she made a plan. First, she had to earn money for flying lessons. She began by taking in washing. She walked 4 miles into town to pick up the laundry. She carried it home. She scrubbed the garments, starched them, wrung them out by hand, and hung them on a clothesline to dry. Then she pressed the clothes with a heavy iron heated on the kitchen stove. It was hard, unpleasant, boring work, but Bessie never felt humbled by it. She was willing to work at anything that would bring her closer to her goal. By day she worked. At night she read the books she constantly borrowed from the town library. By the time she was 19, Bessie had earned enough money to take her next step. She moved to Chicago. There she took classes in a beauty school for African Americans. Through the months of training, she walked the cold winter streets to classes. Her savings lasted just long enough for her to complete the course. For the next 5 years, Bessie worked in the White Sox barber shop. She manicured the nails of customers while they had their shaves and haircuts. She took a second job working at a chili parlor. She saved her money. When she had enough, she began to look for a flying school. She quickly learned that all doors to aviation were closed to her. A black woman wanting to fly airplanes? Unthinkable! But Bessie Coleman refused to take no for an answer. She introduced herself to Robert S. Abbott. He was the African American owner of the Chicago Defender, a respected newspaper in the city. She hoped he would have some ideas for her, and he did. A few women were flying in France, he said. He suggested she learn to speak some French and then go to France to become a pilot. Bessie studied French until her teacher thought she could get by. Then, with help from Mr. Abbott and some of his friends, she traveled on a ship to France. Bessie was grateful to Mr. Abbott. She once told a newspaper reporter, "He is the man who gave me my chance. I will never forget him." In France, the first flight school Bessie visited refused to accept her. They said that 2 women students had recently been killed in crashes. That did not scare Bessie. She found another school. At last, she began to learn to fly. Shortly after she began her flight training, Bessie saw an accident. One of the male student pilots was killed. "It was a terrible shock to my nerves," she wrote, "but I never lost them. I kept going." After 10 months of tough training, Bessie passed all the tests. She stayed an extra month to learn aerial acrobatics. In September 1921, she sailed back to the United States, the world's first licensed black woman pilot. Bessie had kept in touch with Robert Abbott. In New York, he proudly arranged her first American show. The announcement stated, Chicago Aviatrix, to show New Yorkers how she does her stuff. Bessie Coleman will give an aerial acrobatic exhibition on August 27th. This will be her first flight in America. Rain canceled the show, but a few days later Bessie performed at Glenn Curtis Field in Long Island, New York. Soon after, she put on a show at Checkerboard Field in Chicago. Bessie gave a dazzling performance. She did loop-de-loops, slow rolls, snap rolls, and tail spins. The crowd went wild. After that, Bessie became a celebrity. She performed acrobatic flights all over the country, sometimes alone and sometimes with small groups of pilots who had flown in World War II. Early in 1924, Bessie had an accident. Her plane's engines failed. Several broken ribs, a broken leg, and many cuts and bruises could not stop her. In the hospital, she told a reporter, "You just tell the world that I'm coming back." And of course, she did. In 1925, as she toured the country, Bessie began giving lectures in schools, churches, and theaters. She urged African American audiences to get involved in aviation. There would soon be great opportunities, she said, and they must be a part of them. Partly because of Bessie Coleman, many young African American men became military pilots during World War II. On April 29, 1926, disaster struck again. Bessie and another pilot were in the air, but someone had carelessly left a wrench lying loose in the cockpit. It slipped and jammed the airplane's control stick into the full forward position. This sent the plane into a dive from which it could not recover. Both pilots were killed. Bessie was just 34 years old. Bessie Coleman has not been forgotten. In 1990, the mayor of Chicago honored her memory by giving the name Bessie Coleman Drive to a highway leading to Busy O'Hare International Airport. In 1992, the city leaders in Chicago wrote, Bessie Coleman continues to inspire untold thousands of young persons with her sense of adventure, her positive attitude, and her determination to succeed. In 1995, the U.S. Postal Service issued a stamp in her honor. It shows Bessie in her leather flying helmet and jacket, ready to climb into the cockpit and soar high above the earth.